Good morning, everybody. This is the Mack Road Church of Christ Sunday Samuel to Chronicle study. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 22. And if you want to take a look on this chart here that we have that I show you every week, we're looking at David during this time here between chapter 16 and 31. And that's also the decline of the reign of Saul. Here we have Saul's reign, and he began to reign here in chapter 9 through 13. Well, actually, he's reigning through the whole thing, but basically right here, he was told that he's no longer going to reign in chapter 13. And so we see the decline of Saul's reign is what we have. We saw that David was anointed, and now we have him in exile here. He's being chased by King Saul. And if you remember, he had just gone over and eaten some bread from the priest that he wasn't supposed to eat. And you remember Jesus used that illustration. And also, we then saw that he tried to go hide with the king of Gath, and he had to feign being mad. And so that's kind of where we left him off last week. So let's pick him up here in chapter 22. Sorry, thought I had this already done. Let me get here to chapter 22, and then we can get started with a little bit of reading. It says in verse 1, So David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his uncle's fathers heard of it, they went down there to him. Everyone who was in distress and everyone who was in debt and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them. Now, there were about 400 men with him. And David went from there to Mizpah of Moab. And he said to the king of Moab, Please let my father and my mother come and stay with you until I know what God will do for me. Then he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. And the prophet Gad said to David, Do not stay in the stronghold. Depart and go into the land of Judah. So David departed and went into the forest of Aherath. And so what we have here is we have, as a result of David having to flee, remember David was fleeing from the presence of Saul. Saul was out to kill him, that he came to stay in the cave of Adullam. And apparently that was like quite a big cave where a number of people could live or could at least stay in for security. And then all you have to do is just guard the front door, you might say. But anyway, when they found out he was there, his brothers, his father's house, and all who heard went to him. So people who understood that David was fleeing, and they understood that he was fleeing unjustly, they went to him. Not only that, but in verse 2, it says, And everyone who was in distress and everyone who was in debt and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them. And certainly that kind of reminds us of Jesus and the fact that Jesus is our captain, and the people who come to him are those of us who are in distress. We're in distress because of sin, excuse me, because of drugs, because of uncontrolled lusts, maybe even greed or other things that cause us to not be the kind of people that God wants us to be. And so therefore we come to Jesus, and he's king over us. And so David is king over these people, and he's leading them as God leads those people who come to him and repent and are trying to do what's right. Now verse 3 says, And David went from there. By the way, there's about 400 men with him. So it wasn't like there was just a couple of people. There was quite a few people. And what that meant is that David, because he seems to be their leader, would have to figure out a way to feed these guys, and would have to figure out a way to take care of them and to clothe them and to give them what they needed. Now, certainly, many of these men, no doubt, were hunters and warriors and people like that. But still, David would have to make sure that they're provided for and that they have what they need. And so in verse 3, it says, And David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, Please let my father and my mother come and stay with you until I know what God will do for me. Now, it was quite customary that whenever you were a fleeing king, that you would take your family, especially your mother and your father, and you would put them in the charge of some allied kingdom where that king would take care of them and watch over them while things were happening with you. And so that's what David is doing here. So he went to Moab, and there in Moab, he went to the king of Moab, and he placed his mother and his father there. And so he left them there because he wasn't sure what God was going to do with him. And he didn't want them to be hurt in any way, certainly. And we see that also with Jesus. When Jesus was on the cross, Jesus knew that he was going to die, and therefore he was not going to be able to take care of his mother anymore. So he told John, behold your mother, and told Mary, behold your son. And so John then took her from that day to take care of him. And so we see that good children take care of and provide for their fathers and their mothers as they age. And that's part of our responsibility. And so you see David doing that as well here. Now, verse 4 says, then he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. So as long as David didn't have his permanent place, where he would be king and set up his kingdom, or set up his capital, you might say, his parents stayed with the king of Moab, and they graciously took care of him. Now, verse 5 says, and the prophet Gad said to David, do not stay in the stronghold, depart and go into the land of Judah. So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. Now, what's interesting here is you have one of what we call the non-literary prophets, Gad. Gad didn't write any books, but he was still a prophet from God. And as a result of that, he told David that David couldn't stay in the stronghold because apparently maybe Saul had found out where David was staying, and therefore wanted to protect David. And so God told Gad to tell David that he needed to go and go into the land of Judah. In other words, depart from there and go into the land of Judah. And remember that Judah was basically his home territory, and because he was from Judah. And so he might find individuals there who would be willing to take him in or at least protect him for a little while. So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. So he goes into a forest there in order to hide himself from Saul. Now, verse 6, it says, then Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered. Now Saul was sitting in Gibeah under the tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing around him. And Saul said to his servants who stood around him, hear now, O Benjaminites, will the son of Jesse also give to all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? For all of you have conspired against me, so that there is no one who discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. And there is none of you who is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in ambush, as it is this day. So Doeg, the Edomite, who was standing by the servants of Saul, said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. He inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. Then the king sent someone to summon Ahimelech, the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's household, and the priests who were in Nob, and all of them came to the king. And Saul said, listen now, son of Ahitub. And he answered, here I am, my lord. And it says, and so Saul then said to him, why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he would rise up against me by lying in ambush, as it is this day? And we're going to go ahead and stop there for just a minute at 14, while we take a look at some of this up here as we cover it, and so we understand what's going on. So Saul is hiding himself, and David is hiding himself, and Saul is looking for him. And Saul hears that David and his men had been discovered. In other words, they found out where they were. And so Saul then was sitting in Gibeah under the tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing around him. And so basically he's sitting there under this tamarisk tree, and as he's doing that, all his soldiers or his cabinet or his commanders and leaders, they're all around him. And he basically accuses them of conspiring against him by not telling him that Jonathan had made a covenant with David. And so therefore he's looking at them as if they're traitors. And verse 8 says, for all of you have conspired against me, so that there is no one who discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse, and there is none of you who is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in ambush, as it is this day. Now, I don't know whether Saul didn't really know. I don't know whether the men, Saul's cabinet, knew that Jonathan had made a covenant. I don't know if any of that's true, but it doesn't really have to be true for Saul to use it as a means of trying to promote his cause, and that is to kill David and trying to get his men after David. And so he accuses his servants of basically committing treason or betraying him because they didn't let him know that Jonathan made that covenant, and they didn't let him know when David had been discovered. In other words, they didn't tell Saul that people know where David is, because, and I'm sure because those men really didn't believe that David should be killed or David should be hunted because David hadn't done anything wrong. And so I'm sure there's a little bit of that in there, but nonetheless, they were still trying to stay faithful to Saul. Now, verse 9 says, then Doeg the Edomite, who was standing by the servants of Saul, said, I saw the son of Jesse come into Nob to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. So you remember in the last chapter we read, it says that David went to Nob, and he went to Ahimelech, and he asked for some provisions and a sword. You remember that? And so Ahimelech gave him the consecrated bread, which wasn't lawful for them to eat, but he gave it to him anyway. And if you remember, during that time, Doeg was there, and Doeg is an Edomite. He's not a national Israelite. He is from one of the nations that God is going to totally destroy, and is an enemy of Saul, or of Israel. And it could be that Doeg had been captured as a young child and was made into a servant. And so if you remember, he was the chief of the shepherds of Saul. And so he squeals on David, or he squeals on Ahimelech, the priest. Verse 10 says, he inquired of the Lord for him. Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for David. That's what Doeg is saying. And gave him provisions and gave him the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. And so Doeg basically squealed and told Saul, what the other men didn't want to tell Saul, because they knew Saul would get mad and go after him and want to kill David. And it doesn't really appear that the men wanted to go out and strike David or kill David, because they knew that he was basically innocent and that Saul was full of jealousy and envy. And it says in verse 10, and he inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. So that's the first time Saul hears that Ahimelech basically helped David. Now, if you remember, when David came to Ahimelech, he told him that he was on a mission from the king. You remember that? We talked a little bit about whether that was a lie or whether it wasn't a lie. We talked a little bit about that, but that's what Ahimelech thought. Ahimelech thought David was on a journey for Saul, and so why wouldn't he help him? But verse 11 says, then the king sent some to summon Ahimelech, the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's household, the priests who were in Nob, and all of them came to the king. So all of the priestly family, not just Ahimelech, comes with Ahimelech to where Saul is, so that they can be brought up on these charges, you might say. And in verse 12, it says, and Saul said, listen now, son of Ahitub. And he answered, here I am, my lord. And Saul then said to him, why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he would rise up against me by lying in ambush, as it is this day? And so basically, Saul says Ahitub Ahimelech helped David to conspire against him and to ambush Saul. And of course, none of that is true. David wasn't trying to kill Saul at all. He's just trying to keep from getting killed. And so verse 14 says, then Ahimelech answered the king and said, and who among all your servants is as faithful as David? And even the king's son-in-law, who is captain over your guard and is honored in your house. In other words, Ahimelech says, well, why shouldn't I help him? He's your right-hand man. Why shouldn't I inquire the Lord for him? He's your faithful servant. He's the captain over your guard. And matter of fact, he's even your son-in-law. And then he says in verse 15, did I just begin to inquire of God for him today? Far be it from me. Do not let the king impute anything to his servant or to any of the household of my father, for your servant knows nothing at all of this whole affair. In other words, basically what Ahimelech says was, I have always helped him. I've always inquired of the Lord for him. Basically he's saying, how was I to know that he was no longer in good standing with you? And therefore, why would Saul expect him not to help him? He'd been helping him before. And he says basically that he knows nothing about anything that's going on. Now, I want you to notice a word here, or a phrase that's used right here in verse 15. He says, do not let the king impute anything to his servant. Now, the reason that Saul is going to kill David is because Saul imputed something to Ahimelech. What he imputed to Ahimelech was that Ahimelech was guilty and was lying, even though Ahimelech wasn't, that Ahimelech was trying to conspire against Saul, even though he wasn't, and all of that was imputed to him. It was placed upon him, even though he didn't deserve it. And it's interesting that what this tells us is that oftentimes you and I in our relationships, especially when we're mad at somebody or we're looking to harm somebody, will impute motives to them that they didn't have, or actions to them that they didn't mean, and will do it because we want to accomplish what we want to accomplish, and so therefore we'll impute those things on other people. And we definitely have to be careful about doing that, simply to save our own skins or to benefit from it for whatever reason we might have. And so we need to be careful how we deal with people. And so basically, Ahimelech said, I don't know anything that's going on. I've always helped you and David, and I've always inquired of the Lord. So why in the world would I think anything different? Now, verse 16, but the king said, you shall surely die. Well, what crime had he done? Well, he hadn't done any crime, except for the fact that the king imputed something to him. The king said he did something which he didn't say. And so it says, surely you will die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's household. So not only was Saul going to take out his vengeance, his anger on Ahimelech, he was going to kill all the priests. And remember that Ahimelech at this time was apparently, if he wasn't the high priest, he was certainly one of the chief priests. And I believe he was the high priest. And Saul had no qualms about killing him and about imputing sin to him. And that's what people have done with Jesus. Jesus is our priest, and people have imputed sin to Jesus. People have said that Jesus isn't really God, he was crazy. And so they impute that to Jesus, that he was crazy. Others impute the fact that Jesus really didn't die, and that he swooned and then went off and just kind of disappeared. And so they impugn that on him. They impugn the idea that him and Mary Magdalene, or some of the ladies that were watching out for him, he committed adultery with them, or he committed fornication with them. And so they'll impute all kinds of things to God or to Jesus in an attempt to justify the fact that they refuse to believe him. And so therefore they think that Jesus shouldn't be accepted, just like Saul here is believing that Ahimelech shouldn't be accepted because of what he imputed to him. And so just because we impute something to somebody doesn't make it true. And so we need to understand that because that's what's going on here. And so he doesn't just impute it to him, but he imputes it to his whole household. And that also happens with Jesus and his church. Some people impute things on the church that the church, never does. Like we don't love homosexuals. We love homosexuals just as much as we love adulterers, and we love fornicators, and we love drunks, and we love people who are addicted to drug, and people who are lustful. We love all of them. Now, we don't like what they're doing in any of those categories. We don't like what they're doing because we understand that in the end it's going to hurt them and hurt other people, and love demands that we don't hurt other people, not in our present action and not in our action in the future, that we don't hurt other people. And so the world, however, will impute all kinds of motives on the church, on the Christians, to make them seem like they are intolerant, they're unloving, that they're not concerned about the world, that they're selfish. And so they impute on God's people the same thing they impute on Jesus. And that's what they're doing here with Ahimelech and his household. So Saul wasn't just going to take revenge on Ahimelech, he was going to take revenge on the whole household. Now verse 17 says, and the king said to the guard who was attending him, turn around and put the priests of the Lord to death, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew that he was fleeing and did not reveal it to me. But the servants of the king were not willing to put forth their hand to attack the priests of the Lord. And then the king said to Doeg, you turn around and attack the priests. And Doeg the Edomite turned around and attacked the priests, and he killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. And he struck Nob, the city of the priests, with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and infants, also oxen, donkeys, and sheep, that he struck with the edge of the sword. But one son of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. And then David said to Abiathar, I knew on that day, when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have brought about the death of every person in your household, in your father's household. Stay with me. Do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, for you are safe with me. And so, as a result of Saul impugning the motives of Ahimelech and imputing on him guilt, he wanted him dead. And so it says in verse 17, and the king said to the guards who were attending him, turn around and put the priests of the Lord to death, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew that he was fleeing and did not reveal it to me. In other words, basically he told his men, kill him. I believe they should die, and the reason they should die, here's the reason they should die, and he gave them the reason, and none of the reasons he gave them was true, but he imputed that to them, and so therefore he treated them and acted towards them as if they had done that. But when he told his men to slay him, those who were Israelites, those who understood the law, they all refused, because you're not supposed to kill the Lord's anointed, whether he's the high priest or whether he's the regular priest. You're not supposed to put those people to death or execute them, especially when they're not guilty. And he says, but the servants of the king were not willing to put forth their hands to attack the priests of the Lord. So basically they had to take a stand. Are they going to stand with Saul, even though he's their captain, even though he's their king? And maybe he's the one that gave them their positions. Not only are they going to have to, excuse me, sorry about that. Not only do they understand that Saul is the one who's giving them everything that they have, but they're not willing to stand and do something sinful just because he says so. And that happens with Jesus as well. Many people who come to Jesus at the loss of their family or the loss of their friends or the loss of their job, but they come to Jesus because they want to do what's right. They want to come to the light. And so these guards weren't willing to kill any of the priests. And no doubt that would not put them in good standing with Saul. Now, verse 18 says, then the king said to Doeg, you turn around and attack the priests. And Doeg the Edomite turned around and attacked the priests, and he killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. So basically, Saul commissioned Doeg to do it, and Doeg apparently enjoyed it because not only did he kill the 85 men who were standing there, but then the next verse tells us he went to the city of Nob and killed all of the people that were in Nob. So he ended up killing all of the city of Nob and everybody who lived in it. Verse 18. And Doeg the Edomite turned around and attacked the priests, and he killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod, and he struck Nob, the city of the priests, with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and infants, also oxen, donkeys, sheep. he struck with the edge of the sword. But one son of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. So basically, he kills everybody who was of the family of Ahitub, with the exception of Abiathar, who we know is going to become a priest for God and for David. But Doeg kills everybody else. And certainly that tells you the attitude and character of Doeg, and that is that, that he really doesn't care about God. He just is a bloodthirsty individual who's looking to move up in his rank. Remember, he was the chief shepherd, and when he's doing something that nobody else will do, maybe the king might move him up a little bit higher, but of course it's being accomplished by doing wicked things. And that's what some people believe today, that they have to do wicked things in order for them to succeed, when God in essence tells us to believe in him and he'll exalt us, to humble ourselves and he'll lift us up. And so that's where God's kingdom is different from the world's. And so it says that Abiathar fled after David, verse 21. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. And then David said to Abiathar, I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, I brought about the death of every person in your father's house. And so David then is feeling bad because he feels responsible for what's happening with the priests and with Doeg. Now, David really didn't do anything. David didn't do anything wrong, but as a result of his actions, Saul had Doeg kill the priests. And what's interesting is David is feeling sad, even though he had really no responsibility in it. But he understood that the actions that he did were kind of the catalyst for that activity. Whereas Saul, who is the king, he should feel sorry. He should feel sad for killing priests, and he doesn't. And so you have the one who did kill the priests, who didn't feel bad, and you have the other king who didn't kill the priests but felt bad about them being killed. And certainly that shows you the difference between the king of the world and the king over God's kingdom, because God does not delight in the death of the wicked. God is not looking for revenge to execute people so that they'll just die. He wants them to repent. He wants them to change, and he wants them to be faithful to him. And so that's an interesting contrast that you see here between these two kings. And so basically David tells Abiathar, well, come and stay with us, because not only are you out with Saul, so am I. And he's your enemy and he's my enemy. So therefore come and stay with us and we'll take care of you, and you don't have to be afraid of Saul getting you and executing you. And so that brings us to the next chapter, which is chapter 23. And in chapter 23, we have David's activity when it comes to him fighting against the Philistines, even though he's living in the Philistine land, that he goes and fights against them. And so it says in verse 1, it says, then they told David, saying, behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are plundering the threshing floors. So David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, go and attack the Philistines and deliver Keilah. But David's men said to him, behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the ranks of the Philistines? And then David inquired of the Lord once more, and the Lord answered him and said, arise and go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand. So David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines, and he led away their livestock and struck them with a great slaughter. Thus David delivered the inhabitants of Keilah. Now it came about when Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, fled to David at Keilah, that he came down with an ephod in his hand. When it was when it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah, Saul said, God has delivered him into my hand, for he shut himself in by entering a city with double gates and bars. So Saul summoned all the people for war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. Now I want to stop there and just cover a little bit about these 8 verses. In verse 1, we notice that they told David that the Philistines were attacking Keilah. Now, what's interesting is, why tell David? David's not the quote official king, even though God commissioned him to be king. David wasn't the official king, Saul was. Why didn't they tell Saul? But what you find here is that they go and tell David because they understand that David would protect them. And they understood that David would come and deliver them from the Philistines. And so therefore, the men didn't go tell Saul, they told David. And so it says, behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are plundering the threshing floor. In other words, they're taking their food, because that's what the Philistines would do. The Philistines would live in their own land until it was harvest time, and until it was, time to reap grapes or to reap fruit or whatever it might be, shear your sheep. And then they would come down and they would take all the produce. So basically you did all the work, and then they would come and take everything from you and go back to their home country, and then they'd live off of it. So that's the way they would live. And so when they were plundering Keilah, or they were attempting to plunder Keilah, David inquired of the Lord and saying, shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, go and attack the Philistines and deliver Keilah. Now, notice that God is talking with David. God is no longer talking with Saul. God is now talking with David. And certainly this is an example or an illustration of God talking with Jesus, of God commissioning Jesus to go. And every time Jesus mentions doing something, he says, the Father sent me. So Jesus is doing the Father's commandment, just like David is doing the Lord's commandment. And so David talks to the Lord and Jesus talked to the Lord to find out what God wanted them to do. And that's exactly what they did. So David asked, should we go and attack the Philistines and deliver Keilah? Now, there was certainly some danger in David doing this, because remember that they're after him. The army of Saul is after him. And though they understand that he really isn't trying to do anything against Saul, they're under command to kill him if they find him, or to fight against him. And so there's a little danger in exposing yourself and going out and fighting in Keilah. And so verse 3 says, but David's men said to him, behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the ranks of the Philistines? In other words, they said, well, we're kind of fearful here. We're hiding ourselves in the countryside of Judah, and now you want us to go expose ourselves if we fight against the Philistines? So they were a little afraid. So what does David do? Verse 4 says, then David inquired of the Lord once more. And the Lord answered him and said, arise, go to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand. And so David was reassured, and David's men were reassured that they should go off. And so that's, this is a good example for us. When we have something that's important to do, we should pray to the Lord and ask the Lord to bless us, and ask the Lord to help us in the decision we're going to make, or to give us clues about it, or to move us in the right direction, you might say, or to open doors for us. And I believe God does all those things for us. And it doesn't look like he's doing miracles, but I believe that God does do those things because he takes care of his people. And so here's the same thing. So it says, verse 4, then David inquired of the Lord, verse 5. So David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines, and he led away their livestock and struck them with a great slaughter. And thus David delivered the inhabitants of Keilah. Now, I want you to notice that there's something interesting happening here. What I want you to notice is that as David helps other people, God provides for David. Did you notice that? Verse 5. So David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines, and he drove away their livestock and struck them with a great slaughter. So rather than the Philistines taking the property of Keilah, David took their property, and therefore he had some food in order to feed his men for quite a while as he as he was, taking their livestock and struck them and kill them. And then not only that, but he would also have more swords for his men. Because if you remember, the Philistines didn't allow them to have blacksmiths, so they couldn't forge their own swords. But whenever David would win a battle, his men would acquire more swords and more weapons. And so it's interesting that as you help other people, God also helps you. And that's what we notice here. And it says, and thus David delivered the inhabitants of Keilah. Now it came about when Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, fled to David at Keilah, that he came down with an ephod in his hand. Now, the reason that it's kind of funny, I would have thought that this statement would have been made first, because that would have answered the question that everybody's thinking, and that is, how did God communicate with David, up here in the first 5 verses? And the answer is because when Abiathar came, he brought an ephod. And if you remember, that ephod was kind of like that part that was worn on the breastplate that had a Urim and Thummim on it. And a lot of people believe that Urim and Thummim was the way God would talk to his priests or would be inquired of. And that way, some people believe that for example, David, like in this question, says, shall we go up? It's not a, can you explain to me how we go up question. It was a yes or no question. And so most scholars believe that, that ephod, one side represented no and one side represented yes. And if the answer was no, then the no side would glow or would sparkle or something. And if it was yes, then the yes side would sparkle or glow. But the point is that David is inquiring of God. And that's the important thing to remember. David always inquired of God. David tried to inquire of God. Matter of fact, the times when David got in trouble are the times when David didn't inquire of God. And that's when he would get into trouble. Like we read when he went on his own to try to hide in Gath, you remember? And then he heard what they were saying, and he figured out he better pretend to be a crazy guy so he could escape. Now, as far as we know, he didn't ask God, should I go over there? Had he asked God, God would have probably directed him to a different place. But either way, all I'm pointing out is David was always praying to God. And certainly that's an example of Jesus, that Jesus always prays to God and God delivers him out of his hands, out of his enemy's hands. But it's interesting that the ephod statement is found in verse 6. Now verse 7. When it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah, Saul said, God has delivered him into my hands, for he shut himself in by entering a city with double gates. Now, I want you to think for just a minute. Saul is out to get David. He wants to kill David. He's planning on killing David. He's trying to find David. So now he finds out that David is in Keilah, and he's excited because there's only one entrance. There's only one main door to Keilah. And so if he can go and stop up the main door with his army, then they'll have David trapped and they'll be able to kill him. But the part that I want you to look at is that it says that Samuel says, God has delivered him into my hand. Now here's why I think that's interesting. Saul is crediting God for this situation because Saul is looking for justification for what he's doing. Every once in a while, you'll find some guy, for example, who divorced his wife and married some other lady. And you ask him, well, why'd you divorce your wife? Well, we fought all the time. And certainly God didn't like that. And then God introduced me to this other lady, the secretary in my office, and we get along really good. And so therefore God was giving her to me. Well, is that what God said? Or is that what you think? Because what God says is that you're supposed to love your wife until you die. That's what God says. There's no place where God says, go ahead and divorce her if you want, if you don't like her, or if she burned the toast or whatever. And that was the argument that they had during the days of Jesus. And that's why Jesus says from the beginning it wasn't so. God never intended for a divorce. Any divorce God didn't intend. Not even for, quote, as we call it, the right reasons. There are never right reasons for a divorce. There are bad reasons for a divorce. Somebody committed adultery. That's a bad reason. But nonetheless, God understands, but it's still because of the hardness of people's heart. Now, all I'm simply pointing out here is that we often look at situations that we think God has given to us to deliver us out of some problem that we see that in essence violates what God directly tells us. And so we don't live by the circumstances of our life. We live by what God says, no matter how the circumstances look. And so when he says, God has delivered him into my hands, for he shut himself in by entering a city with double gates and bars. And verse 8 says, so Saul summoned all the people for war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. Now David knew that Saul was plotting evil against him. So he said to Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod here. Then David said, O Lord God of Israel, your servant has heard for certain that Saul is seeking to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down just as your servants has heard? O Lord God of Israel, I pray, tell your servant. And the Lord said to him, he will come down. Then David said, will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will surrender you. Then David and his men, about 600, arose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. And when it was told Saul that David had escaped to Keilah, he gave up the pursuit. And David stayed in the wilderness in the strongholds and remained in the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not deliver him into his hand. And so now as we read this, the rest of this, as Saul is thinking that God is the one who's going to allow him to kill David, and that God has set him up so that he could kill David, notice what happens. So when he finds out that David is in this city that only has one entrance, then he summons all the men of war in order to go down and fight against David. And it says, now David knew that Saul was plotting evil against him. So somehow David heard that Saul was coming. So he had a couple of questions. So he asked Abiathar the priest to come and bring the ephod so that he could ask some questions. And of course, he asked two questions. One of them was, will Saul indeed come up and destroy Keilah, on my account? And the answer God gave him is yes. Now, I know the answer that it says is, will the men of Keilah surrender me to his hands, and will Saul come down just as your servant heard, O Lord God, I pray you. And the Lord said, he will come down. And so it says he will come down, but it could have just easily been a yes, a yes answer, because that's what he was asking. Will Saul come down and will he destroy this city? And God could have just said yes. And in which case he's saying, yes, he will. He will come down. Now, so I don't know whether God actually spoke these words. He certainly could have, or whether it was just the ephod that did its thing, as I mentioned. But either way, God was talking with David. And then he also asked, and by the way, in this case, notice that Saul was worried about the city of Keilah. That was his first question. Saul is seeking to come to Keilah to destroy this city on my account. See, he was concerned about the city first of all. And so he asked, what will happen? Because he's going to come down and destroy the city. And so there's only one way to keep the city from being destroyed, and that is to surrender David to Saul. And so they asked, or he asked, will they do that? And God said, yes, they'll turn you over. And so in verse 13, it says, and then David and his men, about 600, rose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. And when it was told Saul that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the pursuit. And so basically it says that he gave up the pursuit because God had delivered him. Now, there's a couple of interesting things in here. David started out with 400 men. Now he has 600 men. So another 200 men joined him, probably because, when he went to protect Keilah, they saw how his activity was a righteous cause. And so they were willing to join his righteous cause. And so when it was told Saul that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the pursuit. And so David now has 600 men, and Saul gave up. And notice why, verse 14. And David stayed in the wilderness in the stronghold and remained in the country in the hill, in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not deliver him into his hand. So Saul thought God had delivered him into his hand. God says, no, I didn't deliver him into your hand. So remember, we don't live by what we see. We live by what God says. Now verse 15. See if we can't finish this today. 15. It says, now David became aware that Saul had come out to seek his life while David was in the wilderness of Ziph in Horesh. And Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David at Horesh and encouraged him in God. Thus he said to him, do not be afraid, because the hand of Saul, my father, will not find you. And you will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you. And Saul, my father, knows that also. So the two of them made a covenant before the Lord, and David stayed in Horesh while Jonathan went to his house. Then Ziphath came up to Saul at Geba, saying, is David not hiding with us in the stronghold of Horesh on the hill of Chila, which is on the south side of Jeshiman? Now then, O king, come down according to all the desire of your soul to do so, and our part shall be to surrender him into the king's hand. And Saul said, may you be blessed of the Lord, for you have had compassion on me. Go now, make more sure, investigate and see his place where his haunt is, and who has seen him there. For I am told that he is very cunning. So look and learn about all the hiding places where he hides himself, and return to me with certainty, and I will go with you. And if he is in the land, I will search him out among all the thousands of Judah. And then they arose and went to Ziph before Saul. Now David and his men were in the wilderness of Moab, in the Arabah, to the south of Jeshiman. And when Saul and his men went to seek him, they told David, and he came down to the rock and stayed in the wilderness of Moab. And when Saul heard it, he pursued David in the wilderness of Moab. And Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men on the other side of the mountain. And David was hurrying to get away from Saul, for Saul and his men were surrounding David and his men to seize them. But a messenger came to Saul saying, hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid on the land. So Saul returned from pursuing David and went to meet the Philistines. Therefore, they called that place the Rock of Escape. And David went up from there and stayed in the stronghold of En-Gedi. And so as we notice this section, we notice that David became aware of the fact that Saul was out to seek his life, or was out to kill him, as he had been before when he was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh. And Jonathan came out to him and arose and encouraged him. And I really like this right here, and encouraged him in God. Encouraged him in God. That's the best kind of encouragement anybody can give anybody, is to be encouraged in God. Stay faithful to God, stay faithful to his will, believe in him, trust him, and he will protect you and watch over you. Verse 17, thus he said to him, do not be afraid, because the land of Saul, my father, will not find you, and you will be king over Israel. I'll be next to you, and Saul, my father, knows that also. So Jonathan understood that David really didn't have anything to fear, because God was not going to let Saul, Jonathan's father, find David and kill him. And Jonathan understood that David was going to be king, and Jonathan was planning to be next to him. In other words, was going to be his commander. That's what he was planning. And Saul, his father, knows this. In other words, Saul knows that David's going to be king, and his line is going to end, as far as the royal line is going to end. Now, verse 18. So the two of them made a covenant before the Lord, and David stayed in Horesh while Jonathan went to his house. So they made another covenant. They're making agreements all the times about taking care of each other during that. And it could be that the covenant they made was that when David becomes king, that Jonathan would be his right-hand man. That's certainly what they'd been talking about before. But either way, they made a covenant. In other words, they were in agreement to help each other and to encourage each other. Verse 19, then Ziphites came up to Saul at Gibeah, saying, is David not hiding with us in the stronghold? I'm just checking something here real fast. Okay. And it says, is David not hiding with us in the stronghold? So these men basically came up and told Saul that David was hanging around in their area. And so Saul made an agreement with them that they should find out all of David's hiding places, so that when Saul comes to fight against him, Saul can be directed to these places and be able to kill David. And so Saul was extremely happy. He says, may you be blessed of the Lord, for you have had compassion on me. Go now, make more sure the investigation and see his places where his haunt is, and who has seen him there. For I am told that he is very cunning. And so basically he told him, go find out where he's at, so that when I come down, he won't be able to hide from me, because he's a sneaky guy. Verse 23 says, so look and learn about all the hiding places for himself, and return to me with certainty, and I will go with you. So, you can be my guides, and that way we'll be able to find him among 1,000 people in Judah. And so it's kind of like him saying, then we'll be able to find this needle in a haystack, because that's how they viewed David and his men. Now, verse 24 says, then they arose and went to Ziph and before Saul. And now David and his men were in the wilderness of Moab, in the Arabah, in the south of Jeshimon. And when Saul and his men went to seek him, they told David, and he came down to the rock and stayed in the wilderness of Moab. And when Saul heard it, he pursued David to the wilderness of Moab. So David, David is one step ahead of Saul all the time. And no doubt that's because God has taken care of him. And a matter of fact, it gets so close that here in verse 26, it says, and Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men were on the other side of the mountain. And David was hurrying to get away from Saul, but Saul and his men were surrounding David and his men to seize them. In other words, while they're coming on one side of the mountain, David's coming on the other side of the mountain, kind of like, two people going around a tree. And as long as the tree's in front of them, they can't face off. And of course, what's interesting is that God is the one who determined which way for Saul to go and which way for David to go. Had one of them gone a different way, rather than them missing each other, they would have clashed and created a lot of bloodshed and war. And so you see God's hand in this. And so it says in verse 27, but a messenger came to Saul saying, hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid on the land. So apparently, while this is going on and Saul seems to be getting closer to David, then all of a sudden Saul has to leave his chase and go down to protect the land of Israel, because that was his job. He was the king. And so he was supposed to go down there and be able to deliver them out of their hands. So he took his army and left. So Saul returned from pursuing David and went to meet the Philistines. Therefore, they call that place the Rock of Escape. And David went up from there and stayed in the stronghold of En-gedi. And so we see David being protected by God, being taken care of by God, as Saul is out to kill him. And as Saul is concerned about his personal reign and rule, he's really not concerned about anybody else, especially not the priests of Nob. He ends up having to kill them, and therefore has that on his conscience as well. All right, well, we'll go ahead and stop there. Pray the Lord blesses you and keeps you and holds you in the hollow of his hand.